If you're like me and work in a small garage space, you know how important it is to make the most of the space that you do have. Even if you're not in a small shop, the Folding Workbench is a great workspace that is able to fold up into the wall and be out of the way. Yeah, you heard right, it folds up into the wall. Retractable casters allow this workbench to move around easily wherever you need it to go. The large tabletop gives you ample space to work on projects of all shapes and sizes. Lastly, it is made up of mostly construction lumber, so this build will not break the bank. I am confident that the Folding Workbench will be one of your favorite pieces of furniture in your shop. For the plywood top, I had my local lumber yard where I got the plywood cut it to its final dimensions. But if where you got your plywood doesn't cut it for you, you can cut it to its final width on the table saw and then to its final length with a circular saw, and you could put the plywood on some sawhorses or on a big piece of insulation on your garage floor. Before I start the build, I'm going to cut my 2x4s to more manageable lengths because 8 feet is a little tough to work with. I'll then be cutting the rounded corners off of each 2x4, which means I'll be cutting about 1/8 of an inch off of each side. That will bring each 2x4 to a width of 3¼ inches. After I do all that, I'll be sanding each 2x4 with 120 grit sandpaper so I don't have to do any of that later. I'm also planing each board with my electric planer, but it's just for aesthetic reasons and totally optional. If you wanted to make this same workbench but shorter than 76 inches, you can, but you just have to take into account that the workbench will not be as tall because the legs will have to be shorter if you want to fold them in. Last thing before we start, don't just go with my measurements in the plans blindly. Make sure you measure everything to fit before you cut each piece. I've cut all 4 of my tabletop frame pieces a little long so I have a little wiggle room when I'm cutting the miters. I'm going to cut a miter on one side of all 4 of the tabletop frame pieces, and then when I cut the 45-degree miter on the other side of each piece, that's when I'll cut those pieces to their exact lengths. Always run a test piece to make sure that your cuts are exactly 45 degrees. I'm making these cuts using my table saw with my crosscut sled, but you can also use a miter gauge on your table saw or your miter saw if it does those 45-degree cuts. Now that I have all my tabletop frame pieces cut, I'll glue and clamp them all together. I'll be using these 8-inch 90-degree clamp squares. It just makes the glue up go a lot smoother and ensures that every piece is at 90 degrees. As with all the tools and accessories I use in this build, I'll put links to all of them in the written plans. After clamping the pieces together, I'll recess 2 screws into each long frame piece. Then I'll hide those screws with dowels that are 3/8 of an inch. Next, I'm recessing some 2.5-inch pocket hole screws to attach the tabletop frame to the tabletop. I'm not using any glue so that I can easily replace the tabletop in the future when it gets really beat up. I'm putting tape on my Forstner bit at 1 1/8 high to know exactly how deep to drill my holes. I'm using my 3/8 inch Forstner bit to recess these screws to a depth of 1 1/8 inches. Okay, it is time for me to cut this tabletop support piece to size, and I'll secure it to the tabletop frame using recessed 2.5-inch construction screws. I'll secure this exactly in the middle of my tabletop, and I'll hide the screws on both ends with some 3/8-inch dowels. When I was breaking down my material into more manageable pieces, I already cut my 4 leg pieces to 34.5 inches long. Now I'm cutting 4 additional leg pieces to 7 inches long each on the miter saw. Then I'm gluing those to the bottom of the 34.5-inch leg pieces, making sure the ends and the sides are perfectly flush. When you're gluing the short additional leg piece to the table leg, glue it to the side that does not look as nice, because this side will be completely hidden by the end of the project. Now I'm cutting the lower leg support pieces to 31 inches long. Don't just blindly cut those to 31 inches. Measure the space in between your tabletop frame to make sure that it is the perfect length. To make the notches in these lower leg support pieces, I'm using my table saw and just my regular blade. I'll make multiple passes until I have a notch that's 1 5/8 inches deep and 1.5 inches wide. You'll see what this notch is for later in the build, but it's for the lower support stretcher. Now I'm gluing the long additional leg piece to the leg structure with just glue. I'm using the lower leg support piece as a spacer because that's going to get attached a little bit later. The long additional leg piece does not need to be flush with the top of the leg when you glue it up, because you'll be cutting that flush when the glue dries. I'm giving each leg structure a final sanding, and I'm also hand sanding the edges so they're not as sharp. Then I'm cutting all the legs to their final length on the miter saw using a stop block so that each leg can be the exact same length. Then I'll drill my hole near the top of each leg piece, and this hole is where the screw is going to go into. It will be easier to drill this hole now before I round over the top. I'm just using the bottom of my propane torch to mark where I need to make my cuts, but you can use another circular object if you find that something else works better. Then I'm rounding the top of each leg piece, and this will allow the legs to fold up and out when complete. Next, I'm drilling a hole 3/8 of an inch into the side of the tabletop frame, and I'll use each leg as a guide. Then I'll attach each leg with a bolt, 2 washers, and a nut. All right, we're getting pretty close to being done. To attach the lower leg support pieces, those are the pieces with the slot cut out of them, I'm gonna use glue and some screws. I'll recess those screws and then I'll hide them with dowels. The upper leg support piece, the piece without the notch cut out, will be attached using glue and recessed screws. I'll also hide those screws with dowels. This piece is important because it's gonna act as a stopper to make sure the legs are at exactly 90 degrees. Now I'm cutting the lower support stretcher to its final length. I'm cutting a notch out of both ends of this stretcher that is 1 5/8 inches by 1.5 inches. But remember, don't just go off of these measurements. Measure how big the notches need to be exactly based on the workbench that you've just built. Okay, I am here from the future to give you a little tip. After attaching the leg assemblies to the bench, I realized that the bench was a little wobbly. To make the workbench a lot less wobbly, just use a socket wrench to really tighten the leg assemblies where they attach to the tabletop. And then a little later in the build, you'll be attaching a diagonal cross brace, which will totally take out that wobble and make the workbench very stable. I'm using hardwood edge banding to cover the plywood edges on my tabletop because it'll make my workbench look just a little bit nicer. I'm using 4/4 alder, which is actually 3/4 of an inch, and I'm cutting 1/4 inch strips using glue and a lot of tape to adhere it to the edges of the tabletop, and then cutting off the excess with my router and a flush trim bit. Let's put together some retractable workbench casters. If you've bought the exact set that I've put in the plans, you should have 4 components that make up the casters, including the wheel, 2 bolts, one slightly longer than the other, 3 nuts, and this big one will be for the wheel, and then 2 tools to put it all together. You'll have 4 of these sets to make up the 4 casters. Now we're not going to worry about the wheel just yet. We'll put that off to the side and we'll attach that after we screw in the caster base to the actual workbench leg. First I'll take this base piece. This is the piece that will screw in to the actual workbench leg, and then I'm going to use the longer screw to attach the silver piece to the bottom of this base piece, kind of where it slants down. Now when you're attaching the silver piece, make sure the 2 side walls are going up like this when you attach it and they're not pointing down like this. Now I'll take the pedal and attach it like this with the ridges facing up using the slightly shorter bolt. And I'll secure it using the small nut. Now I'll secure this to the leg using my template that came with the set of casters. I used one of the screws that it came with to mark exactly where I need to drill the 6 holes. Okay, I'm getting ready to cut the wall mounts for the workbench. I'm cutting the top and bottom pieces to their final dimensions using the table saw and the miter saw. Before I cut the notch on the bottom piece, I'm going to first make some marks. I'm going to first mark where the bottom of the tabletop meets the wall, and this can be either when the casters are up or down, it's totally up to you. Then I'm making some marks on the bottom piece so I know exactly where to drill the holes when I attach it into the studs on the wall. Now my workbench actually can't go right up against the wall because I have this cement step on the side of my garage. So I tilted my workbench against the wall and saw that it went down actually 1/4 of an inch. So just to be safe, I'm actually installing the bottom piece of my wall mount 1/2 inch below where the bottom of my tabletop meets the wall. For the bottom piece, I'm cutting a notch along the entire length of it that will be 13/16 of an inch by 1/4 inch. I'm using my regular blade for this and I'm not messing with the dado stack just because it'll be a little quicker if I keep my regular blade in there. I'm taking an 8-foot 2x4 and clamping it to the inside of one of the long sides of this workbench diagonally. This will be the diagonal cross brace and will keep the workbench from wobbling. I'm now marking where I need to cut each side on the miter saw. I'm adjusting the miter saw to match the mark I made on each side. This should be the exact same angle on both sides of your cross brace. Next, I'm making a mark in the center of each leg that is 1 5/8 inches down from the upper leg support piece, and then 1 5/8 inches up from the lower support piece. I'll use a 3/8 inch drill bit to drill a hole in this spot, and because my drill bit's not quite long enough, I'll need to take the clamps off and finish drilling this hole in the diagonal cross brace. To make this workbench really stable, use a socket wrench to tighten the nuts on each side of the cross brace and on each leg. That's not going anywhere. Just make sure to loosen the nuts on the legs a little bit before you put the workbench on the wall so that the legs can fold in easily. You did it! I am super proud of you for completing this build, and remember, be kind, be awesome.